Once we've carried out our needs analysis all over the mind map, we're probably looking at a mind map or even a series of mind maps from multiple observations with an awful lot of needs on them. Very typically, we'll see students have multiple tens of needs, and it could even stretch into the hundreds of needs from a set of observations. If I wanted to order that set of needs, to get them in an ordered list of the most important at the top and the least important at the bottom, that would be a huge task. Really impractical. And typically we want to try and have our stakeholders help us do that ordering, at least in part. So if we said to people, well, I'd like you to sit down and help me order this list of 200 needs, they're probably going to leave the room. So one technique we can carry out here to try and reduce the number of needs is called clustering or affinitization, grouping needs together. At the lowest level, that task is simple deduplication. This need that we saw on Tuesday is the same as this need that we saw on Thursday. We only need to test that once. We only need that to occur once. That's deduplication. But also, sometimes you'll write needs on different mind maps in subtly different ways. But when you look at them, you realize that they're actually the same need, the same underlying issue is going on there. If we tested this issue or this need and people said, yeah, that really matters, we've got two good contributors to it that we understand. So if you look at the diagram at the bottom there, you see our basic needs that we've extracted from our mind maps at the bottom there. But then we start to go up a level to level 2, where maybe we cluster them and write a slightly different or a slightly more all-encompassing statement, the red post-it note in this case, that captures the members beneath it. So now we only need to test one thing, the red one, rather than all of the needs at the bottom, to get an idea from this giant set that we have as to what's important and what isn't. You can go up another level. You could cluster those level 2s to level 3s. That might be getting a little bit too abstract. That might be getting a little bit too close to Cure World Hunger, rather than the actual detail of being down in the weeds at the bottom, or a good summary at the red level or level 2. So this is the concept of clustering. If you think about observational research as a ground-up process, that's the way I like to imagine it. We went out and we gathered insight, and that was very, very specific. And then we deduced and extracted, analyzed needs from that insight using the process of root cause analysis. Now we're going to take those needs and we're going to cluster them. Some needs will not cluster, they'll stand alone on their own, and that's fine. But if there are things that we start to see, actually that's the same issue, then we'll start to cluster them together and write a broader needs statement. So let's look at that in action. Here we see from our previous observations, mums need to grate the correct amount of an ingredient without secondary measuring steps. That was a need we extracted from the mind map. We also extracted mums need to eliminate unnecessary transfer steps associated with measuring grated ingredients after grating. Those two are clearly very, very similar, a slightly different take on the same problem. So we could write a cluster statement or a broader statement that captures them both. Mums need to grate sufficient ingredient without secondary steps or utensils. And we could test that with mums and say, how much does this matter versus another need or another set of clusters? And they may say more or less. So that's a useful way to deduplicate and to reduce the number of needs that we have to test. I've got another one over here on the right-hand side. Mums need to capture material of varying volumes as they grate. You might remember that one. It turns out that I didn't have anything else like that. That was the only instance of that I had in my mind map. So it becomes its own cluster. So I'm going to test those two orange ones in my market research. And it's fine if one need just goes straight up to become a cluster in its own right. We try and do this, and typically out of 100 needs, if done diligently, you'll see that clustering will reduce 100 needs down to maybe a much more manageable 25 or 30. And that's the kind of volume that you can test with people, and they'll stay engaged with you as you try and get scores on those different clusters from them. And you can do that safe in the knowledge that you can unwrap that cluster and know what contributed to it, know what the underlying needs were later on. Now, as I said, you can keep going and cluster up. So we could take mums need to grate sufficient ingredient without secondary steps or utensils, and mums need a grater that can capture material of varying volumes. We could roll those two and say mums need to efficiently capture and measure grated ingredients in a single step. And that might be fine to test at that level as well. Just be careful that you don't get to, mums need an all-encompassing grater that solves all their problems. That would be Cure World Hunger level. So the ladder of abstraction matters here. Try not to get too abstract, but equally get the number down to a manageable 25 or 30 that you might be able to test with people. I'll give you a very specific example from my world. Starting from the bottom of this slide, we had some needs for surgeons carrying out a hernia repair in an operating room. And they use a plastic woven mesh that's put in to help reinforce the abdomen and the body to help stop hernias happening again in the future. And fixing that mesh is really rather tricky. It's like holding the mesh in place and tacking it with special little stitches. And getting it even is quite hard for surgeons to do. And we noted that surgeons need the mesh to provide an indication if they get that mesh untension, an uneven tension during fixation. We also saw that surgeons need a fixation method that can accommodate uneven tension. So if they don't get it right, it can't cause problems. We saw that surgeons need to minimize tension differences across the mesh during placement. That would be ideal. And surgeons need to minimize the displacement of these tacks or stitches due to uneven mesh tension. 4 needs taken from very different places. And I know that because notice how I've put a unique code on each of my needs. From UK, and it wasn't 2010, it was UK Hospital 2, and that was need number 10, and then University Hospital, and then another US hospital, and then BLV is another hospital in the US. So I can identify where that need came from, and which mind map, and even which need on that mind map that is, which is useful if I want to look at the context around it. But back to my clustering process, I've taken those 4 needs and I've wrapped them up into one cluster. Surgeons need mesh to minimize unwanted effects of uneven tension during fixation. It captures all of the members below it, but now I only need to have one conversation with people, and I can unravel it later on into all of the things that contribute to it that I have captured below. That's the process of clustering or affinitization. It's not a perfect scientific process. There's some art and some interpretation, but your goal is just to get down to what really matters here so that you can then have a conversation with people to determine what they say would really make a difference. I included this image because this is how I do clustering in reality. This isn't really a spreadsheet process. I like to write my needs out onto Post-it notes and then stick them on the wall, and then I can shuffle them around. And what you'll see my students doing, they'll find a wall somewhere, a glass wall, whiteboard or whatever, and they'll scribble out their needs or print them out directly from their mind maps onto Post-it notes or pieces of paper, and then they'll have them stuck or taped to the wall, and they'll be moving them around. And they might take some hours until they finally got it all clustered. In this example, in the photograph, the pink ones are the cluster statements. So they're doing it vertically in columns, and the cluster statement is the top with the members that have been clustered beneath it or affinitized beneath it, arrayed vertically below. So it's a useful way to do it in space and in real time. If you're working in the electronic realm, you can take that same concept, that same process, and actually do it on a laptop. There are various virtual Post-it note applications out there, and I don't mind what you use. One I like to use is called Stormboard, and it's like a virtual Post-it note. You can import or type in need statements. I've used the yellow ones to be consistent, and then shuffle them around, move them around, and then create cluster statements, the pink ones, at the top. So Stormboard is one example, and there are various other pieces of software, and I'm sure there will be more as this video completes. So you can do it literally on the wall or in the virtual space as well. So to summarize all of that, the process of needs analysis starts with insight, which we went out and gathered in the field. We go through root cause analysis, that why process, to arrive at need statements. And we try and keep those at a similar level of abstraction. After we've done all of our needs analysis, then we'll maybe cluster and deduplicate and see what affinitization we can do between those needs to reduce the number of things that we have to then subsequently prioritize. And there are these things at the very top, which would be clusters of clusters, which we might call much broader themes. And we might actually decide that this is a theme that we're not going to go after. It's not in scope for this project, but we know it's real and it existed because we saw it happen. But there may be another theme that we say is right in the sweet spot of our project, and we absolutely want to look at those clusters with our stakeholders.